By late 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become the largest battlefield on Earth. From the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles of open water separated fleets that were hunting each other in darkness. Aircraft carriers dominated headlines, but it was often the destroyers, lean, fast, and relentless, that decided who lived and who sank in the night. The balance of naval power was shifting. After the early Japanese victories of 1941 and 1942, the momentum had begun to change at Midway and Guadalcanal. Yet Japan's surface fleet remained dangerous. Its cruisers and destroyers were expertly trained for night combat. Their crews drilled relentlessly in low-visibility engagements, mastering coordination, optics, and torpedo tactics. They believed that darkness was their ally. The Americans had learned that lesson the hard way. In the waters around Guadalcanal, U.S. ships had been caught off guard in brutal night encounters. Japanese destroyers running high-speed reinforcement missions, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, slipped down the narrow channels of the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness. They delivered troops and supplies, then vanished before dawn. When intercepted, they fought with deadly precision. At the heart of their lethality was the Type 93 torpedo, what the Allies would later call the Long Lance. It ran farther and hit harder than anything the U.S. Navy possessed at the start of the war. Invisible wakes, devastating explosive power, and disciplined launch tactics made Japanese destroyer squadrons terrifying opponents. More than once, American cruisers found themselves shattered by explosions they never saw coming. But while Japan relied on doctrine refined in peacetime exercises, the United States relied on something else: adaptation. American destroyer design had been evolving throughout the 1930s, from the Farragut class to the Benson and Gleaves classes, and then to the Fletcher class entering service in 1942. Each generation grew more capable. The ships became longer, more stable, and heavily armed. 5-inch dual-purpose guns gave them flexibility against both surface targets and aircraft. Improved fire control systems increased accuracy, and beneath their decks, powerful engineering plants drove them to speeds exceeding 31 knots. 31 knots was not just a statistic, it was survival. In the vast Pacific, engagements were often a matter of who detected whom first, and who could close the distance or break contact fastest. At 31 knots, a destroyer could cover more than 35 miles in an hour. That speed allowed American commanders to intercept supply runs, reposition during battle, and execute flanking torpedo attacks. Speed meant initiative. Speed meant control. But speed alone was not enough. The real transformation came with radar. Early in the war, radar was imperfect and sometimes misunderstood. By late 1943, however, American crews had learned to trust the strange glowing shapes on their screens. Radar could see through darkness, rain squalls, and smoke. It could detect ships beyond visual range. It could measure distance and bearing with cold precision. This technological edge began to erase Japan's advantage in night fighting. Instead of stumbling into ambushes, U.S. destroyers could now track enemy formations before being detected themselves. They could coordinate attacks silently over radio circuits refined for discipline and clarity. Task forces operated as integrated units, each ship aware of its role in the larger choreography of battle. Behind this growing effectiveness stood an industrial force unlike anything the world had ever seen. American shipyards were launching destroyers at a staggering pace. The Fletcher class alone would eventually number 175 ships. While Japan struggled with limited industrial capacity and dwindling resources, the United States replaced losses and expanded its fleet simultaneously. Shipyards in places like Bath, Maine, and San Pedro, California, worked around the clock.
Welders, electricians, and machinists, many of them new to industrial labor, turned steel into warships in months rather than years. Each hull that slid down the ways represented not only firepower, but endurance. Even if one destroyer fell, another was already being fitted out. This combination of speed, radar, and industrial depth began to reshape naval tactics. American destroyer squadrons shifted from reactive defense to aggressive interception. Instead of merely escorting larger ships, they became hunters in their own right. Commanders understood that initiative was everything. A destroyer captain operating at night had seconds to interpret radar contacts, calculate torpedo spreads, and issue helm orders, all while traveling at over 30 knots. A wrong turn could mean collision. A delayed decision could mean a torpedo striking amidships. Leadership at sea demanded clarity under pressure. By late 1943, a new confidence was emerging within the U.S. Navy. Hard lessons from earlier defeats had forged more disciplined crews. Radar operators were better trained, torpedo tactics were refined, communication protocols reduced confusion in the heat of battle. The once feared Tokyo Express now faced interception by coordinated American destroyer groups prepared to strike first. The Pacific remained vast and unforgiving. Darkness still concealed danger. Japanese ships were still formidable, their crews experienced and determined, but the equation was changing. When two forces met at night in 1943, the outcome increasingly depended on technology, coordination, and who controlled the tempo of the fight. With 31 knots under their hulls and radar in their masts, American destroyers were beginning to seize that control. The stage was set for a new kind of naval warfare, where speed closed the distance, radar pierced the darkness, and small, fast warships carried the weight of strategic momentum. In the black waters of the Pacific, the hunters were no longer running blind.
Darkness in the Pacific was never truly silent. Engines throbbed beneath steel decks, waves struck hulls at high speed, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another force was moving just as fast. By late 1943, night no longer belonged to the side with sharper eyes. It belonged to the side with better signals. American destroyers had learned that the difference between victory and disaster could be measured in seconds. Radar screens glowed faint green inside cramped combat information centers, where young operators tracked blips that represented entire enemy formations. What once had been guesswork, shadows on the horizon, flashes of gunfire, was now data, bearing, range, course, speed. This quiet revolution changed everything. Earlier in the war, U.S. ships had stumbled into Japanese ambushes. Lookouts scanning the darkness could not see torpedoes racing invisibly across black water. Japanese crews, masters of night optics and disciplined formation tactics, struck first and vanished. But by November 1943, American destroyers were no longer reacting. They were detecting, plotting, and positioning long before visual contact. At 31 knots, a destroyer could close the gap with astonishing speed. Once radar contact confirmed an enemy's course, task force commanders calculated intercept angles with mechanical precision. The goal was simple: cross the enemy's path, launch torpedoes from an advantageous bearing, and turn away before the opponent fully understood what was happening. The sea became a chessboard moving at high speed. Coordination was critical. A single destroyer could strike hard, but a squadron working in disciplined formation was devastating. Ships operated in columns or divided sections, each assigned a role: lead for detection, flank for torpedo attack, rear guard for gunfire support. Communication had to be precise and minimal. Too much radio chatter risked confusion. Too little
meant chaos. Radar allowed American commanders to see not just one ship, but entire enemy groupings. Instead of charging blindly, they could plan simultaneous torpedo spreads designed to box in the target. Multiple destroyers would launch from staggered positions, creating overlapping patterns of steel and explosive force. If the first spread missed, the second might not. Speed was the enabler. Running at flank speed, the destroyer's bow cut through black water, throwing white spray into the night. 31 knots meant momentum, momentum that compressed decision-making into moments. From detection to engagement, sometimes only minutes passed. Captains stood on darkened bridges, trusting radar reports relayed from below. Helm orders were short and sharp. Engines strained. Every movement was deliberate. Then came the launch. Torpedoes left their tubes with compressed bursts of air, slipping into the sea and accelerating toward calculated intercept points. Unlike earlier in the war, American torpedo doctrine had matured. Firing solutions accounted for enemy speed and potential evasive maneuvers. Spreads were widened or narrowed depending on range. The objective was not a single dramatic hit, it was probability, multiplied across multiple launchers. And if torpedoes did not finish the job, radar-directed gunfire would. 5-inch guns, guided by fire control systems linked to radar data, could engage targets beyond visual range. Shells arced through darkness toward coordinates determined by electronics rather than eyesight. For Japanese crews accustomed to fighting by silhouette and starlight, the experience was disorienting. Incoming fire sometimes arrived before they realized they had been detected. Surprise shifted sides. Consider the tension in the minutes before engagement. Radar reports enemy column moving at high speed. Identification confirms destroyers, possibly on another Tokyo Express run. The American task force adjusts course to intercept. Silence falls across the formation. No navigation lights, no unnecessary speech, just the hum of engines and the steady voice of the radar plot. Range decreasing. 10,000 yards, 8,000, 6. At these speeds, hesitation could mean overshooting the perfect firing position. Too early, and torpedoes would run wide. Too late, and the enemy might detect the approach and counterattack. Commanders had to trust both their instruments and their instincts. Japanese destroyers were still formidable opponents. Their torpedoes retained longer range and heavier warheads. Their crews were disciplined and brave. If alerted in time, they could unleash devastating spreads of their own. A single long-lance hit could break a ship's back. But radar compressed the element of chance. American destroyers could turn away immediately after firing, presenting narrow profiles while increasing distance at full throttle. Evasive maneuvers were plotted in advance, hard turns, speed changes, coordinated withdrawal patterns. The aim was to strike hard and disappear before return fire found its mark. This was not reckless aggression, it was calculated violence. The combination of radar detection, disciplined coordination, and sustained high speed transformed destroyer warfare. Instead of chaotic close-range brawls, engagements became controlled ambushes executed with technical precision. The side that controlled information controlled the tempo. The side that controlled the tempo controlled survival. By late 1943, Japanese commanders began to encounter something unfamiliar in night battles: uncertainty. Movements once concealed by darkness were now tracked. Approaches once safe were now intercepted. The ocean itself seemed less protective. American destroyers were no longer merely escorts shielding larger ships. They had become independent strike units, fast, intelligent, and lethal. 31 knots was the physical expression of that transformation, but radar was its brain. Together, they turned darkness from a threat into a weapon. and in the black waters of the Pacific, where distance collapsed quickly and mistakes were punished instantly. That combination meant that when American destroyers chose to close the distance, escape became far more difficult than it had ever been before.
The moment the torpedoes left their tubes, there was no turning back. Steel cylinders sliced into black water, their engines igniting as they accelerated toward calculated intercept points. On the bridge, no one cheered, no one spoke. Every man waited. At night, in the Pacific, combat unfolded at terrifying speed. A destroyer traveling at 31 knots covered nearly 1,000 yards every minute. That meant decisions had to be immediate and exact. When radar showed the enemy column closing, the captain had only seconds to determine the attack angle. Too sharp a turn could expose the ship's broadside. Too shallow, and the torpedoes would miss. The objective was to create a kill zone, a space where the enemy's options collapsed. American destroyer doctrine by late 1943 emphasized coordinated torpedo attacks. Rather than firing individually and hoping for a hit, squadrons executed staggered launches. One division might attack from port, another from starboard, forcing the enemy into a narrowing corridor of danger. Even if the first torpedoes were spotted and avoided, evasive maneuvers could steer a ship directly into another spread. But torpedoes were only the beginning. Once radar confirmed hits, or even confusion within the enemy formation, destroyers shifted to gunfire. 5-inch dual-purpose guns, guided by radar fire control systems, could engage targets that were still invisible to the naked eye. Shells screamed across the water, timed and corrected by electronic feedback. Range adjustments were relayed instantly. Splash reports refined the next salvo. For the crews under fire, the experience was disorienting. Flashes erupted from unseen ships, explosions tore through decks, smoke thickened the night. A formation that had been orderly minutes earlier could dissolve into chaos, and chaos was deadly at high speed. A damaged ship might slow abruptly, forcing those behind it to turn sharply to avoid collision. In darkness, even a slight miscalculation could send two destroyers crashing together. Meanwhile, incoming torpedoes, American or Japanese, continued racing silently beneath the surface. Japanese destroyers were not passive targets. Their response, once alerted, was swift and dangerous. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo had longer range than most American weapons early in the war and carried a devastating warhead. A single hit could ignite magazines or break a ship's keel. Japanese crews trained to launch wide spreads, saturating likely enemy positions. The difference in 1943 was awareness. Radar reduced surprise, but it did not eliminate danger. A destroyer captain had to anticipate counterfire the instant his own torpedoes were away. Standard procedure called for an immediate high-speed turn, sometimes a full 180 degrees, to throw off enemy firing solutions. Engines roared as throttles pushed to maximum. The ship heeled hard, spray washing across the deck. Below decks, sailors braced against bulkheads as the vessel carved through its evasive arc. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators tracked not only enemy ships, but also potential torpedo wakes, thin, fleeting lines that could mean disaster. Reports were rapid and precise: bearing, range, possible track. Helm corrections followed instantly. There was no room for hesitation. Close-range engagements intensified the chaos. At distances under 5,000 yards, gunfire became brutally direct. Tracer rounds stitched across the surface. Shell impacts showered metal fragments across exposed decks. Communication lines could be severed, fires ignited, casualties mounted within seconds. Yet discipline held formations together. American destroyer crews by this stage of the war had endured months of combat. Damage control teams drilled constantly. If a compartment flooded, counter-flooding measures were immediate. If a gun crew was hit, replacements stepped forward. Survival depended not only on hitting the enemy, but on absorbing punishment without losing operational capability. The kill zone was not just a geographic space, it was a moment in time when one side retained coordination and the other lost it. Radar-directed gunfire allowed American ships to maintain pressure even through smoke screens. If a Japanese destroyer attempted to withdraw under cover of smoke, radar could still track its movement. Salvos adjusted accordingly, escape routes narrowed. For the sailors on deck, the battle felt compressed and endless at once. Minutes stretched under adrenaline. Every vibration might signal a near miss or a fatal hit. Orders were shouted into wind and engine noise. The sea itself seemed alive with force. And then, as quickly as it began, the engagement could fragment. A torpedo struck home, an enemy ship erupted in flame, another veered away trailing smoke. Radar contacts scattered or vanished. Commanders evaluated fuel levels, ammunition expenditure, and potential reinforcements. Pursuit was weighed against risk. Speed again dictated the next move. At 31 knots, a destroyer could chase a fleeing target or disengage before heavier enemy units arrived. That flexibility was decisive. It meant American forces could choose when to press the attack and when to fade back into darkness. For the Japanese crews facing these coordinated strikes, the psychological impact was profound. Night had once provided confidence. Now it concealed an adversary that could see first, fire first, and maneuver aggressively without losing cohesion. The kill zone was no longer accidental, it was engineered. Each engagement reinforced lessons. Torpedo spreads were adjusted, radar interpretation improved, communication protocols tightened. The combination of technology and disciplined execution transformed destroyer warfare from reactive defense into controlled offense. In the black waters of the Pacific, survival depended on mastering chaos, and by late 1943, American destroyers had learned how to create it, then navigate through it faster than anyone else.
At 31 knots, command was not theoretical, it was immediate, physical, and unforgiving. On the bridge of a destroyer racing through black water, the captain stood exposed to wind and spray, binoculars often useless against the darkness. Below him, in the Combat Information Center, radar operators tracked glowing contacts that represented enemy ships moving just as fast. Between those two spaces, bridge and radar plot, decisions were forged in seconds. There was no time for lengthy deliberation. A contact appeared. Course and speed were estimated. Was it a single ship or a column? Was it screening for larger cruisers behind? Should the squadron close aggressively or hold position and wait for a clearer firing solution? Every answer carried risk. Destroyer warfare demanded decentralized leadership. Squadron commanders issued broad intentions, but individual captains often had to interpret unfolding events on their own. Radio silence was frequently maintained to preserve surprise. That meant initiative mattered, confidence mattered, trust mattered. In night engagements, confusion was the enemy's greatest ally. Earlier in the war, breakdowns in communication had led to ships firing independently, torpedoes launched without coordination, formations drifting apart at critical moments. By late 1943, those painful lessons had reshaped doctrine. Task groups trained to operate as cohesive strike units. Each ship understood its position in formation and its role once contact was made. The lead destroyer might detect first. The flank ships prepared torpedo solutions. The rear elements stood ready to provide radar-directed gunfire. Orders were brief and standardized. Execute. Turn. Fire. There was no room for ambiguity. Yet even the best doctrine could not eliminate uncertainty. Radar contacts could merge or split. Land masses in the Solomon Islands distorted returns. Rain squalls cluttered the screen. A commander had to interpret imperfect information while traveling at full speed toward a potential ambush. The pressure was immense. A wrong decision could expose the squadron to torpedoes from an unseen cruiser. Hesitation could allow the enemy to slip away. Aggression had to be balanced with caution. Commanders learned to think in geometry. angles of approach, crossing patterns, escape vectors. They visualized not just where the enemy was, but where it would be in 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10, and all of it unfolded faster than anyone on shore could imagine. Japanese commanders were equally determined and often highly experienced. Their doctrine emphasized decisive night attacks, disciplined torpedo launches, and aggressive closing maneuvers. But by late 1943, they faced a growing challenge. American radar disrupted the timing on which their tactics depended. When surprise vanished, decision-making windows narrowed. An American destroyer squadron detecting the enemy first could maneuver into an optimal firing position before being seen. Once torpedoes were launched, commanders immediately shifted to evasive action, anticipating retaliation. If radar indicated return fire, formations adjusted dynamically, ships weaving, accelerating, or turning in coordinated arcs. This required extraordinary trust between captains. They had to believe that the ship to port would hold course until the precise moment of launch, that the vessel astern would not drift into their torpedo track, that every helm order would be executed instantly. At 31 knots, a delay of even 5 seconds could alter spacing by hundreds of yards. Leadership extended below the bridge as well. Engineering officers pushed machinery to its limits, maintaining flank speed without catastrophic failure. Gunnery officers interpreted radar-fed targeting data and ordered corrections under fire. Damage control teams stood ready to seal compartments and fight fires the instant a shell struck. Every man had a role in sustaining momentum. Momentum was more than speed. It was psychological dominance. When American destroyers attacked decisively and withdrew cleanly, they projected control. The enemy was forced to react, into improvisation. In night combat, forcing your opponent to react rather than act often determined survival. Some engagements lasted minutes, others stretched into prolonged exchanges of maneuver and fire. In each case, commanders had to reassess constantly. Fuel consumption at flank speed was enormous. Ammunition stocks dwindled quickly in sustained gunfire. The possibility of additional enemy units arriving was always present. Should they pursue a damaged ship into uncertain waters, or regroup and preserve strength for the next encounter? These were not abstract calculations, they were life-and-death judgments made in darkness. Over time, successful engagements reinforced confidence within American destroyer forces. Captains who had once hesitated grew bolder. Squadrons refined their coordination until maneuvers felt almost instinctive. Radar information flowed more smoothly between compartments. Orders became sharper, calmer. The human element, discipline under pressure, transformed technology to advantage. By late 1943, destroyer tactics were reshaping broader fleet doctrine. No longer viewed solely as escorts for battleships and carriers, destroyers were recognized as independent strike platforms capable of altering the course of an operation. Their speed allowed them to screen, scout, intercept, and pursue. Their radar allowed them to see. Their commanders allowed them to decide. In the Pacific night, that combination was decisive. When contact appeared on the radar screen and engines surged to flank speed, everything depended on the clarity of a single voice giving orders into the wind. At 31 knots, there was no pause, no reconsideration, only action. And in those compressed seconds between detection and destruction, leadership determined who would emerge from the darkness still moving and who would be left burning on the sea.
By late 1943, something fundamental had changed in the Pacific. The darkness was the same, the distances were the same, the stakes were as high as ever, but the balance of control had shifted, and it was shifting decisively. American destroyers, once reacting to surprise attacks and torpedo ambushes, were now shaping the battles themselves. Night engagements increasingly ended with Japanese ships burning, sinking, or retreating at high speed under relentless pressure. The era when darkness guaranteed advantage was over.
The consequences extended far beyond individual clashes. Japan's surface fleet had relied heavily on aggressive night operations to offset American industrial strength. Fast destroyers running reinforcement missions, cruisers delivering sudden torpedo strikes, these tactics were designed to erode Allied momentum. But as radar-equipped American destroyer squadrons intercepted more of these runs, the cost of each operation rose sharply. Ships that Japan could not easily replace were being lost. In contrast, the United States was launching destroyers at an extraordinary pace. Shipyards across the country worked continuously, feeding a navy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. When one destroyer was damaged or sunk, another was already completing sea trials. This industrial depth transformed tactical success into strategic inevitability. Speed, radar, coordination, these were battlefield multipliers, but production was the foundation beneath them. The cumulative effect of successful destroyer engagements began to reshape Japanese operational planning. Reinforcement missions grew riskier. Surface actions became more cautious. The once confident thrusts through narrow straits and contested waters were now shadowed by the knowledge that radar could be watching from beyond visual range. Destroyers were no longer merely escorts or support vessels. They had become instruments of sea denial. By controlling night engagements, American forces limited Japan's ability to move supplies, reposition units, or challenge amphibious operations. Every intercepted convoy weakened isolated garrisons. Every sunk destroyer reduced the enemy's flexibility. The Pacific War, fought across thousands of miles, increasingly hinged on control of mobility. And mobility depended on ships that could move fast, strike hard, and survive. The 31-knot destroyer became a symbol of this new naval reality, fast enough to pursue, agile enough to evade, equipped with radar that pierced storms and smoke, armed with torpedoes and guns capable of crippling ships larger than itself. It represented the convergence of technology and training. But perhaps more importantly, it represented adaptation. Early defeats had forced the U.S. Navy to confront uncomfortable truths about preparedness and doctrine. Radar had to be trusted. Torpedo tactics had to evolve. Commanders had to embrace decentralized initiative. The lessons were costly, but they were absorbed. By 1944, American naval forces were advancing across the Central and Southwest Pacific with increasing momentum. Amphibious landings were screened by destroyers capable of intercepting night counterattacks. Carrier task forces operated under protective layers of fast escorts. The cumulative pressure squeezed Japan's remaining surface fleet into ever more defensive postures. Night no longer offered sanctuary. In the final years of the war, large-scale surface engagements became rarer. Air power and submarines dominated headlines. Yet the destroyers remained essential, screening carriers, bombarding shore positions, rescuing downed pilots, and standing guard against surprise. Their earlier night victories had helped secure that broader freedom of movement. The legacy of these operations extended beyond World War II. Radar-directed combat, coordinated multi-ship tactics, and the emphasis on speed and flexibility shaped post-war naval doctrine. Future destroyer classes would build upon the lessons learned in the Solomon Islands and beyond. The concept of a fast, technologically advanced surface combatant capable of independent action became a permanent feature of modern navies. But the story is not only about machines or strategy. It is about the sailors who operated in confined steel hulls, racing through black water at full throttle, trusting glowing radar screens and the steady voices of their commanders. It is about split-second decisions made without hesitation, about discipline under fire, about turning vulnerability into advantage. In the vast Pacific, where horizons stretched endlessly and the sea could swallow entire fleets,
Control was never guaranteed. It had to be seized again and again. At 31 knots, American destroyers seized it. They closed distances in darkness. They struck before being seen. They adapted faster than their adversaries. And in doing so, they helped turn the tide of naval warfare in the Pacific. When the war ended, many of these ships would be decommissioned, scrapped, or preserved as memorials, but their impact endured. They had proven that speed, technology, and coordinated leadership could overcome even the most formidable night-fighting tradition. In the black waters where escape once seemed possible, they had rewritten the rules. And in that transformation, the fast destroyers of the Pacific secured their place among the most feared and most decisive warships of the Second World War.